All right, welcome everyone. And I'd like to welcome you to Jenkins Workflow. What's up? My name is Jesse Glick, and I work for CloudBees on all sorts of Jenkins-related topics, but in particular, I work on workflow. So we're going to talk today about some things that have been happening relatively recently in workflow and some new features that are interesting. I think you got a preview of some of the things from the keynote this morning with Kosuke, for those of you who could go to the keynote. We'll be going into some more depth about how those work and walk you through a demo of how workflow can solve some interesting problems. So just for background for people who aren't so familiar with what Jenkins Workflow is, sometime around the end of 2013, I was talking with some people, including Kosuke, and we were looking at this example of a build promotion pipeline. So this was a continuous delivery example for a mobile application. This version was for Android operating system specifically, but there were some variants that also built iOS images and so on. And it turned out that in order to do all of the tasks required to take developer source code for this entire application, including multiple kinds of clients and some back-end code, and build all of that and run integration tests for it and actually get it onto any kind of live system, you wound up needing to have several different jobs in Jenkins. So on the right side, you can see there's sort of a folder with a collection of different jobs with no clear relationship between them. And on the left side is an example of part of the configuration screen for one of those jobs. If I can remember, I think this was for the first one, the -Android job. And in order to kind of figure out what the whole process was when, soup to nuts, when somebody actually checks in a change, what happens? You have to go through several different configuration screens. You can see, okay, when something that happened downstream of this was okay, then the little star appears next to that build of the upstream project, and then something else happens in response to that. So you have to jump back and forth between several configuration screens just to see what's happening. And if you wanted to make some kind of change to this, say, a developer wanted to add experimental support for iOS, and they wanted to, have some peer-reviewed change that would add iOS into this mix. It's not clear how you do that. You'd have to go into Jenkins configuration and start rearranging this stuff and play with it a few times and try to find something that works. So in response to that, in March of last year, we started working on a feature called Workflow. And this is a new job type in Jenkins in which the entire process that you have can all fit into one script. This is using Groovy language. It's a popular scripting-oriented language that builds on top of Java. It was already popular for all kinds of Jenkins extensions, so we decided to go with that. And the script can call different steps that perform the meat of your work. So first of all, you need to do things on Jenkins slaves. I mean, you shouldn't really be doing anything on the master. You should be farming out any of your real work to slaves. So first of all, you need to get some of those slaves. You need to select what operating system that's running. For any kind of continuous integration job, you're going to be checking out sources of some kind from Git or Perforce or whatever it is you're using. The main thing that will typically do is run some other tool. So make, ant, maven, et cetera. Some kind of build script, tools, different commands that you have that are available on that operating system. In some cases, you might want to launch other Jenkins jobs if you need to keep some things in a set of different jobs. For some cases, people wanted to have a human interaction as part of this process. They didn't want to have the entire thing run completely automated up to deployment or production. Sometimes people wanted to wait for a human approval of some steps. So there might be a quality assurance tester who's taking a look at a staged version of some application and is signing off on it and saying, yes, this doesn't have any obvious flaws, so I want this to proceed to the next stage. So we created all of these steps that let you do all of these things directly using something that really looks like a program instead of a big sprawling configuration screen. And a program that you can keep in version control, that you can peer review, that you can treat like any other code. Another important thing that we wanted to deal with was the fact that we were hearing from a lot of people that they had these processes that were not just a 5-minute, 20-minute continuous integration job. So for if you're just building a pretty small Java component or a little C library or something like that, it's probably just a quick build and it runs and it's done. But some people had these build processes that took 40 hours for a single step. Or for the whole process, that particular build steps might only be 20 minutes, but then it had to go onto a staging server and wait for someone to test it for 24 hours before they click OK. So there's a bunch of things that could go on for hours or days, and people didn't want to have to wait for the last thing to finish before they could restart Jenkins. So if you wanted to update a plugin or something, you just want to update it during your 10-minute maintenance window on Sunday afternoon. You don't want to have to kill off everything that was running and try to restart it all. So we tried to make sure that the things you do with workflow can survive a Jenkins restart. It was an important part. So that's sort of background. We released a 1.0 version in November of last year. And have been getting a pretty good stream of feedback since then. So there's people sending messages to the users list. They've set up a Stack Overflow tag for people to ask and maybe answer questions. And we've been talking to people in various venues. We had a summit in London in March, I believe, where we got some feedback and real-world use cases. So I want to talk about some of the things that have changed since the 1.0 release. We just did a 1.8 release very recently. More or less, these new revisions have been coming about once a month so far. They could come faster, I suppose. One major thing that we realized we needed was that people wanted to be able to keep their whole script in version control along with their actual project sources. So the idea is that everything that your project is doing, including the Jenkins component of it, should all be versioned together in one repository. So we've added some basic support for that so far. One thing that wasn't so obvious at the start was that a lot of people migrating to workflow from other job types still wanted to keep some of their builds in traditional Jenkins jobs. And there's a build step that lets you launch other Jenkins jobs, so-called freestyle traditional GUI configuration jobs. But it turned out a lot of people were using this and really relying on that pretty heavily. And so we needed to add some additional features to that to make it possible to orchestrate different jobs that way. There are some changes with environment variable handling, and there were a bunch of things happened, particularly in March. We sort of got a bunch of people together to implement a bunch of bug fixes and some minor enhancements and things like that. The biggest work that's been going on since then kind of falls into two main areas. One One is a bunch of things that really needed to wait for new facilities in Jenkins core. So we started off requiring Jenkins 1.580. And now for the current releases, we're requiring Jenkins 1.609. So this is the latest long-term support release. The 1.609.1 just came out a couple of weeks ago. And so we're taking advantage of some new stuff in this release. So one important thing is that we're starting to offer compatibility for build wrappers. So in a freestyle project, when you go to the configuration screen, you'll see a section above the build steps that says build environment or something like that. And you can set up some plugins which affect the entire build and sort of set a context for it. And some of those are pretty important, and so we needed to make some changes in Jenkins to make sure that we could support those from a workflow too. And now finally, some of that's possible. So most of these basically set up some environment for the build and then tear stuff down at the end of it. From within a workflow, you can set up that environment and tear it down as an explicit step anywhere within the flow. So you can actually have different environments on different machines in different orders. So one important one is called the XVNC plugin. So VNC is a sort of a remote desktop system, and XVNC is a version of it for Unix servers that lets you have a simulated display. And this is really, really important for anybody who's doing any kind of UI testing. And so I'm going to show a demo of this being used with workflow. Another really popular one is the timestamper plugin that basically puts timestamps into your build log wherever you're doing steps, so you can see how long each thing took. That integration is now going to be available as soon as the plugin maintainer does a release. There's a configuration files plugin that's also pretty popular for keeping some special files on the Jenkins master, things like one example is Maven build settings for connecting to different repositories and things like that. It's useful to keep those on the master and then refer to them from a build. And so that integration is ready to go. Somebody just has to click the merge me button. And one thing that people really often need to do is deal with credentials. So you want your build to be able to deploy to particular servers, check out from authenticated version control repositories, and do all of these things. And in a lot of cases, you just want to be able to pass that password, or sometimes it's a special file with a signature key, something like that. You want to be able to pass that into a build. The credentials binding plugin is available for that. It lets you take any kind of secret that you can store on Jenkins and use it directly from a workflow. So you can keep your build script clean of anything secret, but it can just refer to secrets that you persist on Jenkins. The other major area of functionality that required a new version of Jenkins is we wanted to clean up how workflows appear when you're running a bunch of these things. So these can, again, these can potentially be running for days on end, and they're not necessarily active the whole time. So one thing you want to be able to do is you can restart while a workflow is running without losing state. But using the newest version, it means that if you go to safe restart in Jenkins, so if you ask to update a plugin and restart when Jenkins is idle, that will now restart as soon as all of the traditional jobs have finished. But if some workflow jobs are running, it'll just go ahead and restart immediately. So you don't have to wait for those to finish. And we're also cleaning up native thread usage so that we're consuming less resources while it's running. And there's a change to how the display of the running flow works, which will be better seen in a demo. Probably the biggest thing that we've been working on, and the reason that there haven't been lots of little features in the small releases since March, is that we've been working on Docker integration. So you've probably been hearing tons and tons of hype about Docker, and there was some information about it at the keynote. So if you can think of Docker as a way of portably deploying applications into production. And there's new workflow integration in a plugin called CloudBees Docker Workflow that lets you do that. So it lets you build applications from sources into different kind of containers and then push them to Docker registries and so on. But another really important thing that it does, which is maybe less obvious, is that it turns out Docker is the ideal way to simplify continuous integration infrastructure, even for applications that couldn't possibly be deployed in Docker, even for applications that aren't server applications at all. Docker, as long as your build can run on Linux somehow, that's the only consideration right now. And Microsoft does claim to be working on a Windows version. Docker provides a really, really nice way to totally isolate and define the build environment for any kind of build steps you're doing. I'm going to show how this makes it a lot simpler to specify a build environment. Basically, before this kind of feature was available, if you had sort of specialized tooling requirements for Jenkins builds, you had to put a lot of effort into making sure that the Jenkins slave was set up in a very particular way. So either you had to install a bunch of stuff on the slave and tune the particular, the exact version of the operating system and all these libraries for it, or you had to find various ways of downloading tools on demand into the slave for the needs of particular projects and so on. And it got pretty hard to manage. And it was a lot of burden on the Jenkins administrator. With this system, it's much easier to put all of that information right into the build process itself. So I am going to show how that works. We have a workflow here that I've imaginatively called Docker Workflow. And if you go to the configuration screen, is this font size legible in the back? I hope it's big enough. Okay. So there's really not much in the configuration screen. Basically, all it says is, yes, go to some repository, a Git repository in this case. Look for a file called flow.groovy and run everything you see there. So the Jenkins job configuration is pretty dull, and that's the point. Really, you could drop this configuration into any Jenkins server, and it's going to run about the same. Really, the only thing that's been set up on this server that's at all specific to this job is that we've set up one item of credentials. So we're keeping a password stored in encrypted form on the Jenkins master rather than in the job definition itself. So this is just in this case, this is a login into a Docker registry, which is a place where you publish different Docker images for containers you want to run. And there's some super secret password in here. All right. And if you start this up, anyone who's run earlier workflow releases, anyone who's run earlier workflow releases may notice a subtle difference. So there's only one item showing here, which is the part of Docker workflow. And then sometimes temporarily, Docker workflow itself shows up. So this temporary thing that shows up at the bottom is the Groovy script itself. So that's the program logic. So when that item appears always on the master, that means that your build is talking to Jenkins or it's running logic. And you want that to be a tiny, tiny fraction of the whole process. everything else is really going to be running some external process on the slave. And so that shows up in this main part that runs here. So if you go to the build log, it occurs to me it'd be nice to be able to hide this whole side panel for presentation purposes so you wouldn't line wrap like this. So it's doing a bunch of stuff for us. It's basically checking out it checked out some sources from Git, and then it's doing a bunch of Docker operations here. So what I'm going to do is switch over to the flow script, and let's see if I can make this slightly, let's see. Can people still read that, or is it a little bit too small? Maybe I'll make it this size. I hope you can read it without, even if you don't have a perfect glasses prescription. So as you can see, this is not terribly long. So even with lots of comments and white space, we're looking at a really low screen resolution. We're only looking at a couple pages of configuration for this. So it's short enough that you can mentally digest what it's doing. And if you want to make an edit, you can comment out a line or add an extra line that looks like a similar one. So what we're starting off doing is first that we're saying we're going to be using this particular image called Maven 333 JDK8. So this is a publicly available image. You can get it on Docker Hub. And this is someone who knows something about Maven build tool, has said, OK, I'm going to take the 333 release of it on a particular version of, I think this is Debian Linux, with a particular build of JDK8. And I'm going to package all of that up into a container that provides a well-defined development environment. So whenever you get that image with that tag, you know exactly what version of all of the tools that you're running. You don't have to guess whether there was some weird update got applied behind your back or anything like that. So we're just taking advantage of the work someone else has done and picking up the standard image because it's a useful image for building Maven-based projects without any extra work. And then we're going to be using a custom Docker registry. So this demo actually includes a private Docker registry. So it would be something you would use if your company wanted to publish images internally and sort of look at them before they go out to others. And this Docker keyword is what's introduced by this new plugin. So this is sort of the entry point to anything relating to Docker you need to do. You just say docker.something. And by the way, you can get a full syntax reference right inside Jenkins. So if you go to the snippet generator, so this is sort of the inline help, then it has a list of global variables you can access, and for Docker it has a syntax reference. And then we also have some, let's see, a documentation, CloudBees column, yeah. And we also have a full user guide that shows how to use this in context, if you want that as well. So we're saying we want to use a custom Docker server, and this is the location of it, and this is all you need to do to log into it. So if anyone has tried to deal with authentication to Docker servers and registries, it can be a little bit complicated. This sort of hides all of those details. You just configure credentials with those names in Jenkins. So this is going back to, I can leave this page. This is just looking up this password by that ID in Jenkins. There's also a WIS server that lets you access a password-protected or special internal Docker server too. Otherwise, we just use whatever is running on the local machine. And then the magic happens here. So we take this Maven image that we found on Docker Hub that looked like a good idea, and we say, run the following steps inside of it. So what this means is that within this block, Jenkins has started a new Docker container, a throwaway temporary container based on that image, and any kind of processes that you run within that block. So here I'm saying run a shell step, run MVN. Maven doesn't have to be installed on the Jenkins slave at all. This can be a totally stock, generic Jenkins slave. It just needs a Docker installation. MVN here is actually user bin MVN inside that particular Maven container. So when we run MVN, we know that we're running Maven 333 and we're using a particular version of JDK8 to run it. So all of the guesswork about what exactly you're running goes away. If this build fails, you can just say to your developers, hey, this failed. You get that Maven image, please, and try to reproduce on your laptop. And they can just do a Docker run on their laptop, get the exact same environment, and try to build their code in the identical environment to what Jenkins is using. So it takes a lot of the guesswork out of continuous integration. In this case, we want to actually build a Docker image for our applications. This is going to be a web application. We want to create it as a Docker image. So the way that we're doing that is we're saying after we've built a WAR file, so a Java web archive, I want to build a new Docker container based on that. And when you, let's go over to the project sources. So this is asking to build it from inside the app directory. And this is the application. This pom.xml is basically the Maven build script. But we have a Docker file here, too. And the Docker file is what Jenkins is running after it does the Maven build. And this build is pretty simple. So it says, take a standard Tomcat image, so an application server. This is just a generic image that just runs this application server and expects your application to be in a particular place. And we're just taking the application binary we just built and copy it into the web apps directory where it will get picked up automatically and launched. So whenever Tomcat finds anything in that directory, it launches it. So we've just created a custom image. So if you go back to the build log, you can see somewhere here. So we ran our Maven build. And then we're building a Docker container. So it has to transfer a bunch of stuff to the Docker daemon. And it's saying add our new application. And we successfully built this new image that we just created. With the workflow integration, you can just give that a name. You can just treat it as a local variable. So this is our pet clinic image. And then one line, just say pet clinic image push. So that says, OK, go and take that image and push it to our internal Docker repository. So Jenkins constructed the right Docker command line for it. So it has to do some prefixing of the name with the registry location, all this stuff it takes care of for you. And the registry comes back and says, OK, I successfully took that and I gave it a tag based on the Jenkins build number. So this is sort of basically what we're doing here is just archiving the application as we built it in this job for future reference. So if we ever need to go back and say, there's some sort of really important bug in this version, do you still have a copy of the application as it stood at that, on Tuesday? Yeah, you have it tagged in your repository under this name. But we're not going to promote it to anything further until we do some tests on it. Right? We want to see if it really works. So in order to do the testing, I want to start up a separate Docker container. So for this, I'm going to say build from the test subdirectory, and it's building a totally unrelated project here, actually. I happen to keep them both in the same Git repository for convenience, but these could actually be in different repositories maintained by different teams even. So test, this also happens to be a Maven project, but it doesn't have to be. This is something that's running Selenium UI testing. But but you could have written this using Ruby. Makes it convenient to do these kinds of tests as well. And here's the test in all of its glory. This is not a very exciting use of Selenium. We're just saying, expect that the application is running at this URL. So I'm not going to try to inject a URL or anything. I'm just going to assume that this hard-coded URL is where it is. And start up Firefox and visit the home page and see if we got the right title. So a really dirt simple Selenium test. Okay. Now running Selenium tests can be kind of a pain when you try to set it up from scratch, because okay, you need to make sure everything's connected, that your tests are finding the application in the right place. More to the point, it's tricky because the Selenium tests are normally actually going to fire up a live browser. And getting that to run correctly on a server can be tricky, right? Because a server usually has no graphics card, has no display. So you want to use something like XVNC. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our application image, the pet clinic, and we're going to say, run that. And here's the groovy syntax for a closure. So we're saying, take the application that we just run and give this name pet clinic to the Docker container that's actually running it. So you have this sort of virtual machine that's running Tomcat with our newly built application in it sitting waiting for us. And then we've built another Docker image with our, that is intended only for running our tests. And so we have another Docker file just for the test environment. This is totally unrelated to the application build environment, but it's still part of our project sources. So if you need to tweak something here, you just make an edit to this file and commit, and everything gets updated along with that. So this image for running the tests is a little different. It's also using Maven in this case, it happens to be. But we're also running a VNC server. And I also asked to install this package Iceweasel. This is the Debian Linux version of Firefox. So I want to have a simulated GUI environment, including Firefox web browser inside my test environment. And this installation step, by the way, downloads hundreds of megs and stuff, and installs a bunch of packages. But Docker caches all of that stuff. So you'll see when you run incremental builds that it just says using cache, using cache, using cache. So as long as I haven't changed this Docker file and I haven't adjusted my build environment, this just takes a couple seconds to recreate a complete image for my test environment. And again, I haven't touched anything about the slave configuration. So I don't have to set up Firefox on my Jenkins slave. This can run on any Jenkins slave anywhere, as long as it's Linux with Docker. And then I'm going to launch this test container and use the link command from Docker. This says take my running application container and link it into this new test container under the name pet clinic. So that means that from my test container, the host name pet clinic gets specially mapped to my application container just for the duration of this test run. So it sort of patches up the hosts list for me. So that's why I can use a fixed URL. And then I'm going to run the VNC plugin. So the VNC plugin does a bunch of special stuff in terms of launching VNC the right way, cleaning it up, and doing special features like screenshots and things like that. So if you look at what this did when it ran it, so it was running my application container, and then it was also running my test container, running both simultaneously. And then inside the test container, it sets up VNC. So it's setting up this virtual desktop environment. And then finally I just run Maven. So these are just Java-based Selenium tests, and they look good. All of the tests pass. It does a bunch of cleanup, takes a screenshot at the end, and then it's asking me, how do I like that screenshot? So this is another thing that's different from a freestyle project, is that you can ask humans to pass off, to approve certain portions of the build if you don't want to totally automate it. So here it's saying, take a look at this. Does that look right? And yeah, so here you can see this is the Linux X window desktop with, totally stripped bare, not running a window manager or anything, but you can see Firefox has been running and it actually browsed to that URL and managed to verify the title and took a screenshot at the end. So you can, you can see if there's, if the dog is dead or if there's something really wrong with the application, right, that your test didn't cover. So I'll say yes, I want to proceed. And then finally, the last stage is that it says push under the latest tag. So Docker tags, you can have tags that are basically symbolic links to particular builds of your image. So it's already pushed all of the binaries for the particular build tag. So basically all this is doing is updating this latest tag on our internal registry to point to this build. So if we get all the way to the end of the build and get to this stage, then we've just told anyone using our internal Docker registry, yes, thumbs up, we've tested this particular build of this application and it's passed all of the criteria. This is safe to go to production. So you could have some outside process that's looking for for new things to appear in the registry and deploying them, or you could add another step to physically take that image and push it off to some production servers if you wanted to. But that's the basic idea. And one thing I forgot to show while it was paused for input, at the point that it's paused for input, you will see that that basically the build is idle. So at that point, it's not consuming any resources. It's just saying, OK, I'm just waiting for something to happen, for someone to click proceed or abort. So at that point, it's not consuming a thread on Jenkins. It's not going to show up on the main build queue as doing anything. So basically, it's going to sit out of your way and just be what you would expect a long-running workflow to be, just something that's that's waiting for the next step to happen. So that's the basic idea. Sort of the key feature that we've been working on recently, which I think will be pretty exciting for people who've been struggling to maintain really complicated slave configurations and automating all of these things. I need to leave some time for questions, but I just wanted to go through a few things that we're looking at as next steps that are things we got from feedback and so on. One is certainly compatibility with other Jenkins plugins. So in order for plugins to work inside workflow, usually they need to be modified in some way. Often it's a pretty minor modification, sometimes it's deeper. But we're looking to get integrations for the most important plugins, the ones that people want to use a lot. We've got a few, there's a lot still on the list to do. Things like triggering Jenkins jobs under certain conditions, SCM integration for new version control systems we haven't covered yet. I think currently we have Git's a version Mercurial Perforce. I think another one came in recently. And various kinds of post-build actions. These are things like publishing reports of particular tools in a visual way in the Jenkins UI. That's a common kind of publisher. Or sending notifications to HipChat and things like that that are difficult to do without that plugin. A bunch of features that we've had on the table. One, we often hear people ask for syntax completion for IDEs. So you want to be able to edit this flow script in Eclipse, IntelliJ, NetBeans, whatever you have, and get some assistance for the available steps and things like that. So that's something that's definitely on the table. There's support for matrix builds and so on. I'll just mention specifically the last three are sort of related to something Kosuke was talking about in the keynote, that we want to offer more ways of picking up the definition of the flow from a place that's convenient for you. So that means ideally picking up the whole flow definition from a file that's kept in your versioned repository according to whatever branch that it is you're working with, including support for topic branches, so that it would so that Jenkins would automatically build topic branches as they come in, and be able to keep parts of the flow definition that are common to a bunch of different jobs in a separate place so that they can be reused even more easily than they can now. And one special area is making it possible to create custom DSLs without actually writing a Jenkins plugin. So this Docker dot syntax that I showed is implemented as a Jenkins plugin, although most of the high-level syntax is actually just a Groovy script. We'd like to make it so that you can, if you know a little bit of Groovy, you can take a Groovy definition of how you would like your company's whole build process to look and upload that into some version control repository, and then particular jobs that people write for particular projects would just be 2 or 3 lines that would look more like a configuration file than a program for those people, so that they don't have to get too deep into the details of workflow. And lots of other fixes, lots of things to be done. On the drive down to DC, I sort of got 2 or 3 of these out of the way, but there's a couple hundred other things that are outstanding. So it's going to be some time, but we're definitely listening to feedback on things that people really care about and trying to get some of those in. They'd like to take any questions people have. Stand up to the mic in the center of the room if you want to ask anything. So we have a few minutes, I think, left. Yeah, can you come up to a microphone or just shout? I'll try to repeat your question. Yeah.
And it works.
Excellent.
So you showed a workflow for a Java web app,
Yep.
which is probably pretty common. If someone wanted to create another Java web app, would they have to create the whole workflow again, or would they be able to use parts of the workflow in their workflow?
Right.
Sort of?
So one thing that you can do today, and I was mentioning that we'd like to expand the options for the future, but today you can keep a versioned repository inside Jenkins of different, basically Groovy classes or helper functions, so configuration snippets for commonly used patterns of things. So in the case of this example, the common pattern would probably be, one for run Maven and collect resulting thing into a custom application container. Another helper function would probably be something like run test application container linked to, run test container linked application container with VNC enabled. And you would call that as a helper function and fill in a couple parameters for the file name or the command or something like that.
All right.
So,
Well, where do you keep the helper functions?
so currently, your options are that you can keep those in a special Git repository associated with Jenkins master. Or you can explicitly load them from the start of the workflow from another spot in your workspace. So that could be somewhere else in the same version control checkout, or you could even go and explicitly ask to check out some other repository that your team uses and load from there. So it would be a few lines of boilerplate today, and we'd like to sort of trim that down to 1 line or no lines in the future.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, for time. Yeah, can you, okay, we have someone coming up. Yeah.
Okay.
live.
So I know that you mentioned publishers as the future work, but are there any plugins for reporting right now?
For reporting? you said?
Anything like reporting on Jenkins.
So, yeah, the current publisher integration is fairly slim. The by far most widely used one is integrated, which is the JUnit format test reports. That actually covers people who are using test tools other than JUnit. A lot of them produce results in the same format, so you can use that. That actually has a neat aspect to it that you can't get from a regular freestyle project, which is that you can record test results multiple times from the same build and it will aggregate them. So that's handy for doing multiple stages where you're running different tests, possibly on different slaves in different orders or even in parallel. But there are a lot of other publishers that create different kinds of reports or add annotations of different kinds to the build. So in a lot of cases, it should be easy to add that, but it still needs to be done. Yeah.
Sorry, I was actually thinking about my question when you were answering the last one, but I was interested. What was the name of the plugin that you said does the aggregating the test results across?
It's just called JUnit plugin.
Oh, the JUnit plugin. Okay.
Yep.
I just started hacking on workflow, so maybe this exists and I just haven't found it yet. But is there like a concise doc that lists all the words in the DSL and the parameters that are available to them?
So there's not a static documentation currently. This is something that could probably fall out of the effort to build IDE code completion integration. But currently, your best shot is if you if you go to snippet generator, this is going to list all of the steps that are available in your current system according to your currently installed plugins. And you can get sort of detailed, detailed syntax on the different options that are available for it. So,
Thanks.
yep. Come up to, yeah. They'll kick us out at some point. I'm not sure when, but okay.
Hello?
Yeah.
One question is about...
The mic's not on, I think. So.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah. One question is about like the stages. When we define stages, can we just call upon a particular stages rather than in a specific sequence?
There's not currently a facility to jump straight to a particular stage as such. You can make a workflow parameterized, so you can have you can give the user the option of selecting something when they start the build, and by doing that, you can just write sort of simple if-then statements that say, if they ask to skip this part, then just don't do it. There's not a direct facility just for skipping stages. No. Yeah. All right, that looks like the end. Thank you everybody for coming. We'll be at the Ask Experts booth.